Perfect.
Hey everybody, this is Terry Mitchell with Voice on Fire interviews. And for those of you who may not be familiar with what I'm doing, this is a platform where I get to chat and have great conversations with some pretty amazing people located anywhere around the world. And they may be Australians in Australia, as I've had with Series 1, or they may also be interviews with expats who are somewhere around the world. And in today's interview, I get the opportunity to talk with Lexi Stergakis, and we've known each other for a little while, Lexi, and it is so great to have you as one of my guests on Voice on Fire.
So awesome to be part of it. Thanks, Terry.
Awesome, awesome. So as I said, for those who may not be familiar with this, the platform is designed to provide an opportunity to put the spotlight on somebody who's making a difference, who's taking an action, who's doing something to make a difference in the world, either in their own local community or somewhere globally. And Lexi certainly does that. And Lexi's really phenomenally fascinating person. And I've known Lexi for probably 12 years. And in that time, I've been quite aware of the journey that she's been on. Lexi, I'd love to explore that with you. And we'll start out with my usual questions. And the usual questions are, what is it you do? Why do you do it? And who do you do it for? And I know that you've got a really fascinating story, and you've been on an incredible whirlwind kind of journey around the world. Where would you like to start this? Let's start with, what do you do? Let's tell everybody what it is that you do.
Well, I guess broadly, I work in humanitarian advocacy and research.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been doing that for quite some years. And, you and I met when I was working in the disability sector. And I guess that's how I sort of moved into the international sort of space. I started working with disability organisations in Lesotho. That's a country that's in southern or surrounded by South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And so since doing that advocacy work, I've worked on various range of different themes in like the humanitarian context, in the development context, in lots of different countries, like Liberia, Afghanistan, Somalia. Most recently, I was working in law enforcement.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, so it's been a sort of an interesting journey, but I guess I think a lot of that has led me towards doing more work in the community that I'm from, which is the LGBTQIA+ community.
Mm-hmm.
And so that led me to start doing a lot of work in gender and sexual diversity.
Mm-hmm.
I guess we can talk a little bit about Queer Here in the organisation or the agency that I sort of co-founded with some other activists from around the world, activists, academics and advocates.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that journey started when I was working with UNICEF maybe 5 years ago. I've been working with international agencies for quite some time, but working in girls' education specifically 5 years ago with UNICEF sort of started a conversation with me and some of my friends, which were also doing activism and advocacy around LGBT rights outside of our sort of workplace. And what we sort of found in our academic spaces and also within UN agencies and other international NGOs is that gender and sexual diversity was often not talked about by our community ourselves. And then also that leads to poor representation of LGBT issues, those issues not being on the agenda for agencies, them not being embedded fully, them being represented in a way that's not nuanced and sits within the binary. So a lot of talking about women and girls, men and boys, gay and lesbian. So not a lot of diversity there. So Queer Here sort of started when we all got together and thought, how can we best use our skills to raise the narratives, voices, concerns, advocacy needs of LGBT people or gender and sexually diverse people in countries that are often less profiled, for example, Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and other places that usually don't make it sort of on the map, I guess. And so we started this collective of activists. And then that work that we've been doing now for several years is focusing primarily on, I guess, 4 areas. That's providing technical support to activists that are working in country on their own issues. So gender and sexually diverse people working on issues regarding gender and sexual diversity and their rights around that. So we provide technical support in terms of advocacy support, developing strategies, helping them to develop strategies. And then we provide some advocacy and visibility support. So connecting them with international media agencies or human rights monitors, should they be experiencing human rights abuses. So for example, in Kazakhstan, there was an issue with one organisation, Feminita, that we were working with, in which one of the activists was detained and placed in psychiatric detention. So it's like quickly connecting and raising the visibility of what's happening in the country with international monitors like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, so that they can mobilise funds for lawyers, or at least just put pressure on the government by providing some media attention, so putting a spotlight on that. So that's one of the other things we do. The other thing that we do is document stories, and that's probably the one thing that you're going to really see is the front-facing piece of the work that we do on our website, which is simply documenting human rights abuses and issues within various countries and the various contexts within those countries and communities within those countries. And the effort there is to build a body of evidence for advocacy and visibility purposes with nuance. So we do that with and for those organisations. And then the other arm that we have now, which is just developed in the last year and a half, is an emergency fund. So we have an emergency fund that supports activists, advocates around the world when they are experiencing things like unlawful detention, or if, for example, in the COVID response, we provided funds to sex worker-led organisations in Uganda to deliver food packages and support, rent support to trans sex workers that were experiencing sort of some of the impacts of COVID. Yeah, so that's sort of the work that we're doing right now. I guess it's very early stages since we've only been doing it since 2017, 2018. Yeah, but I think that's sort of a big part of the ongoing work that I've been doing, and something that we really enjoy. And it's and it's a way in which, you know, so academics, advocates and activists that are working on this project that are placed all around the world can sort of support in the background or in the wings these organisations and activists that are doing the real frontline work. We know that they're the best positioned people, obviously, and the experts in their own context. So we thought best to give our support, our technical support, our funds, and our attention to them at grassroots. Yeah, rather than, you know, in the face of having worked within these large agencies and feeling like these issues were not being fully represented. So really it is, for want of a better term, from the ground up, supporting from the ground up and putting these activists and advocates at the forefront of the work. So just raising that to get higher visibility for them. And visibility is often protection in a lot of these circumstances and countries where they are criminalised.
Yeah, wow, that is really quite phenomenal, Lexi. And for anyone that's not really been aware of the impact that being someone from a different part of the community in a way that has often been shunned because it's been either a persecuted group or it's not been recognised. Even in Australia, anybody that was of a homosexual background back in the 70s was still considered to be either criminally, not criminally insane, but they were often put into psychiatric centres or were arrested. And the mindset that goes with that is just so damaging. When people want to just express being who they are, you're giving people that voice in countries where the political situation is often very questionable in its own way, irrespective of everything that's going on in the country. That area, the sexuality and the gender of somebody, that can actually put their lives at risk. Is that something that you've experienced or had any contact with, where people's lives have literally been at risk because where they live, the political situation that they're in?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And most of the whole focus of this organization, or I guess or collective that we are more described as a collective, is that we focus on the most vulnerable, and often that's the transgender community, non-binary community. So absolutely, these people that we've been working with have had their lives threatened either by government or by their community. So yeah, a lot of our focus is on the most vulnerable. So whether that be in Mexico, working in La Colima, and working with the transgender community there to understand some of the very specific threats. Of course, the murders of transgender people are the highest rates in the world in Mexico, but particularly in certain, I mean, if you're in Mexico City, maybe it's, you can maybe have a little bit more freedom in some spaces. But if you're living in a place like Colima or like a smaller city or more rural area, then you're extremely at risk. And, on our website, you can see some of the interviews that we've done with members of the transgender community, some members of the that are part of the sex worker community also, and how also the complex situation or the complex context of Mexico and the control of drug cartels in some of these regions, and how they're actually leveraging off these existing prejudices towards gender and sexually diverse people, specifically the trans community. How they've been brought into that is also very fascinating, and something that needs highlighting. So yeah, that's definitely something that we've been working on. I would say one of the most shocking things is seeing lawyers that work with the LGBT community, for example. I'll come back to Kazakhstan. It's such an under-highlighted fight that they're going through, community that's really suffering. We have things like they're placing people for years in psychiatric detention. So even not the way to sometimes target the LGBT community is not just directly, but the government will go after their lawyers. So the lawyers will then be put in psychiatric detention for years and medicated and deprived of their human rights, their dignity completely. And I think that's even more terrifying, I think. And these activists that we're working with are so brave, because it is a very real threat that they're experiencing to their lives, to their family members' lives. Will just be taken in the middle of the night. This isn't an obscure thing that sort of happens every now and then in some rural areas. We're talking about capital cities also. Like we're talking about places that this is routine. This is not something that's something that only happens every now and then. So it's really been an honor to work with those communities and to support them in the background and those activists, because they are so much at risk. And so, like I said previously, like one of the ways to provide protection in a context where gender, LGBT people are criminalized is by providing visibility. So visibility by protection for people. So that's one of the things that we sort of we emphasize in those places where it is particularly dangerous for LGBT activists and advocates.
Yeah, look, it's horrific to think that one way to disempower anybody, particularly when it's an issue that requires support, is to take away even the legal support and to treat somebody that is trying to support them as a perpetrator, and intentionally, and I'm assuming from what you've said that it's the government who are taking that stance and removing these advocates who are the lawyers in the particular instance you mentioned, and actually putting them into a situation where their rights are taken away, their human right to take action and be somebody that's trying to do the right thing and support somebody. That's a pretty scary process. And just to think that that can happen, you know, it must be really hard for not only for yourself, but also for those people that you are working in the collective with. What sort of ways have you been able to look at handling those situations? I guess I'm looking at from a perspective of what is it that you have needed to do to, besides obviously putting the spotlight on them and giving them the coverage, what other ways in terms of advocacy or what other ways are you showing up for them and helping to put, I suppose, a spotlight on that problem?
Yeah, I think, so visibility definitely one way, connecting them to human rights monitors. So making sure that with these, the part of the advantage with doing this documentation and helping them do the documentation as an outsider. So sometimes that'll be us going into a country and doing the documentation on behalf of, because there's a little bit more protection sometimes. Is that we can use that to feed to human rights monitors. So where there's no routine data collection or systematic data collection because there's a non-recognition of LGBT people, for example, or it's criminalized in that country, we can get qualitative evidence to human rights monitors so that they can get a little bit more about a picture about what's happening in the country. Of course, they're aware of these issues that happen, but you need to get some of those stories out so that they can use that in their advocacy and making that a real priority on the international sort of agenda, let's say. So that's one way of sort of providing visibility, because one of the big issues that we have in countries where it is criminalized or not recognized is that LGBT organizations can't register. If you can't register as an organization, it becomes if the government doesn't recognize you, there's no routine data collection, it makes it very difficult to gather evidence, let alone operate and get funds into the country to support that activism work. So that's why we provide direct emergency funds to those organizations so that they can operate. And that's why we can do some of this qualitative documentation for evidence gathering, so evidence building, so human rights monitors can use that to leverage. So I guess on the other side of things, it's very draining work. It's a very demoralizing work that they're doing. It's their personal and it's political. So I think one of the other ways that we've been able to sort of support some of these organizations is to connect them to similar organizations and activists in other countries that are in a similar situation in terms of how the government is either not recognizing, bullying, intimidating, or persecuting LGBT individuals, and then sort of getting them to share their approaches for sort of maneuvering in specific situations. So I think they're sort of like the ways in which we are sort of doing this sort of gentle background agitation and support. But they carry a heavy burden, and often they're doing research and they're working in this context and they're experiencing the persecution themselves. It's very it's a labor that they so that they carry that's personal as well. So much admiration to them, and it's quite easy as an outsider to provide that support and lose sight of just how much people are living in it and how much of an impact that has on their lives, because they really are just really at the front lines every day. We have a lot of respect for them, and and it's something that's been really eye-opening and humbling experience.
Oh, look, I'm so sure that anybody in places like Australia or even, you know, America or other places in the more advanced countries where we have been granted things like recognition for people that are gender or sexually diverse and people that are entitled to now marry, which, you know, obviously how long have people been fighting just for that recognition, and finally that's happened.
Yeah.
We've had that take place in Australia, and, you know, there's still some really challenging issues going on for some people who, you know, they're not getting the coverage in the media because, you know, people don't want to talk about it and they want to keep that kind of conversation, you know, somewhere over there where they don't have to look at it because it's, you know, it's just too confronting for them. Totally, you know, that's Australia in the, certainly the information that I'm aware of. But I can't even imagine what it must be like to be in a country where, you know, the political situation is unstable at best, and if not run by a dictator of some particular, you know, capacity, where criminalisation is, you know, the control and domination that they use just to stay in power. And I know there's so many issues that can come from all of this. In terms of creating the Queer Here project, what was the foundation for that? Now, you have spoken about it a little bit. Take it back to a time where you found that you and a number of other activists wanted to work together. What sort of brought you all together in the sense of what was the underlying mission? Is that what you've been doing, or is there something else that you can add into that?
Yeah, so some of us are academics, some of us are advocates and activists, and we had been already doing some informal support, and just through we'd come across LGBT Q organisations through our work, and had just been doing the work of ensuring that in our own work that gender and sexual diversity was being recognised, being talked about in a nuanced way, and really pushing for that. And of course, we became very frustrated with the way in which international institutions, organisations, like I said, UN agencies are still talking about these, our communities in binary terms, and it just wasn't moving things forward. I mean, it's a little bit like, I guess we can talk about the disability sector, how it's like an add-on. Oh, here's disability over here, so let's do all of this programming. If we're talking about humanitarian response and emergencies, and how LGBT people or disabilities are treated in that space, it's treated as an add-on. It's not well integrated, and so, you know, we just kept coming up against that in our work. So previously, we'd already been sort of doing this work of pushing gentle agitation within our work, and you find each other, I guess, like you find your allies as you're doing that work in your own spaces, whether that be in the academic space, whether that be in the international development space, or whatever sector. So, and some of us have worked on projects before together as well, in certain countries. So yeah, we just sort of started talking more and more about our frustrations around this, and sharing our experiences about how we were approaching the work, and that, you know, sharing our frustrations about how siloed it was. Well, if you want to do talk about LGBT, well, there's the Department for LGBT over here, so they're doing that work. So, you know, like, it wasn't integrated in the work, right? A lot like disability, it's like, oh, we'll talk to the disability people when we need to talk to the disability people. It wasn't integrated in the work. So yeah, so I guess then we said, well, what's important here? We feel like we need to highlight cultures, different histories. We wanted to get more into the nuance of things, right? And so we started out saying, well, what if we starting to document different cultures, histories, and stories from across the world to try and build a body of evidence around what's actually happening in certain countries and contexts, with that nuance, doing it with and for our community. And raising that, you know, the idea with that was, then we can bring that more into our spaces as points of reference, I guess, to say, oh, here's some evidence over here, or we need to be looking at this, or to get a bit more diversity into into the work and nuance, like I said. So it started like that, and then it expanded as we began working with these organisations, and then as our network of activists and advocates that became involved in the project that joined our work, our collective, as they expanded, our work expanded, and then we saw other opportunities pop up, because of course each context is different, each country is different, each region within a country is different. Little, we've got little, maybe we're in Oaxaca and we have like the Muja community here, and they have certain, maybe they are not looking for, maybe they're looking for something more specific, like, for example, looking more at behaviour change resources or things like that. How can we develop resources to talk a little bit more about or to educate people more about the community? So it can be anything from doing that documentation, helping people, activists and organisations to do the domestication of LGBT rights, or it could be small as, well, how do we work within this very specific community to change attitudes around LGBT people or gender and sexually diverse people? So it's kind of evolved as communities have indicated their needs, and then as we've looked and expanded in our network and grown our collective, then we have also more resources within that. Each person is bringing a different thing, has either a different set of networks, has, again, the academic perspective, has the legal, legislative sort of perspective. So we've been able to provide more tailored support, I guess, and being able to respond in different ways. So that sort of resulted in those sort of 4 primary areas that we're now working in. So it's been, it's evolved. Yeah, it's really evolved. It really started out as a documentary project.
Okay.
It started out really more as a let's record people's narratives. Let's focus on the most vulnerable, and then from there we were providing advice on how to use those narratives at a local level for leveraging advocacy for advocacy purposes, and then focusing on state and national legislation. And then it became more and more. It expanded, obviously, as the needs became prevalent. So it's been quite a journey, and who knows what it's going to look like in another 5 years. Maybe it'll evolve. Maybe we'll just end up being a fund as organisations are strengthened in context. The needs will change, obviously. And I guess
it'll also be a little bit controlled, or not controlled, determined by who it is you're helping. They'll be able to let you know more so, because it does sound one of the most important things, I think, in a lot of what you've said is you're responding to the needs of the communities around you who are coming to you and letting you know more or less how what you're doing is helping or what help they need. So it sounds a lot like it's driven by the needs of the particular communities that you're in, whether it be somewhere in, the Middle European or somewhere in the Asian, wherever you are in the regions, you're actually responding to their needs. And as you say, who knows where it could be in 5 years' time. But I think what's really, really fabulous about what you're doing, what's exciting about it, is that you are a collective of people that are taking a stance and being a voice for people who perhaps don't have that voice. And I think that's what drew me to wanting to have this conversation with you, is what I'm all about in terms of where this fits for me is I'm really about giving the voice for people who don't have a voice. And you're the advocate, you're that person. You have so much background that is driven toward helping communities. And reflecting back a little bit on how we know each other, as you said, we've worked in the disability sector together. And I recall a time when I knew you at that stage. I think you were still in uni, if I remember, or you may have just graduated. But if I'm not mistaken, Lexi, you've since gone on to take on, I think you've got like a second degree, and you've also got other qualifications. Share a little bit about that journey in terms of how it's taken you on the different steps around the world, because one of the other things is, and I kind of say this with a wry smile, it was often a case of, where's Lexi, in terms of which country in the world are you in this time? Because you were traveling so much. You've been in New York, you've been in different parts of Africa. Share a little bit about how you actually started the original journey from the days when we worked together in the same organisation. What were your steps that you actually saw, just that first progression, and what qualifications you have? Share a little bit about that part of your story.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I started out when I was in my undergraduate, before I went to Melbourne and before we met. I was working in the, providing direct support to people with disabilities. I was working primarily with youth that were seeking work, so on work placement, so supporting them when they're on their placement. So I was doing that through university. My undergraduate was in media production, so focusing on documentary. So I've always been sort of interested in people's stories and documenting people's stories in different communities. That always interested me. And then I was working so I was doing this work whilst I was in university, and then I came to Melbourne to do my master's, and then did that with the Australian Centre for Human Rights Education at RMIT University. So focusing on human rights, and then I don't know, I guess coming to Enecto, which is the organisation that we worked for at that time, they were really focusing on, so I started out doing just case management with people with disabilities, which was fantastically rewarding. And at that time in Australia, or I guess specifically it was really happening in Victoria, was this reorientation of services for people with disabilities. So moving from these group homes and group packages where the government would provide X amount of money, and you would go to what we call a day service, where you would just be in a group situation with maybe 100 other people with disabilities, and you would go and do things like bowling or whatever activities. And for a lot of those people that were in those services, it wasn't focused on the life that they wanted. It was the life that the government could afford to provide them, or wanted to. It was the option that was provided to them by the system, basically. So I started to work a bit more around when the government was like, okay, well, how can we do individual support packages for people so that they can choose the life that they want, the services that they want to access, they can pursue the work that they want to pursue, they can pursue the education they want to pursue, like most people are afforded in the broader community, let's say. And so that really interested and excited me, and I was really happy to be part of an organisation that was thinking a bit more big picture on the rights of people in terms of their right to education, and their right to work, and what it is that made a full life for them. And I think that really got me interested in that. And then I was doing that, as I said, I was doing that master's at the time, and I was focusing a lot in my thesis and my research around disability. And that sort of led me to sort of take a job with the Australian government, a placement overseas in Lesotho, working with disability organisations, or the peak disability body in Lesotho. And that was an opportunity to work more strategically on legislation, and also doing work with communities around educating around disability, destigmatization, all of this work. So yeah, really, I guess it just kind of all came together. It wasn't like that first step, I guess, all sort of came together through just working in the disability sector, and then it all just sort of clicked, like my interest in working with communities and how communities work and how people can live the lives, or their best life, the life that they want to live, and make decisions and be more autonomous in their life. So yeah, so that's how that first step started. And then I just continued in advocacy, because my specialization then became more advocacy and strategic direction, how to get to that point, whether it be at the legislative level, whether it be at the community level or whatnot, or focused on institutional change. So from working in that, I just started picking up different jobs in different areas of interest. So after doing that work for 2 years in Lesotho, working with some absolutely outstanding, amazing advocates who managed to get the first Disability Equity Act up while I was there, which was absolutely amazing. After doing that, I was just, I got the opportunity to work in Liberia on community health workers, and so like access to health and health services in remote communities. So that was a fascinating opportunity, and worked with government and a very small organisation there on piloting community health workers and different models for how we can do outreach support to these very tiny communities in the middle of sort of the jungle, like very dense sort of remote areas, densely. It was kind of amazing. And then Ebola happened, and then I kind of slipped a little bit into the emergency side of things.
Wow.
So then that led me to work into different contexts that were a little bit more unstable, like Afghanistan. Then I started working more specifically in nutrition in Afghanistan. So really it came from an advocacy, human rights based approach that I've been working in advocacy, and then started working more in advocacy on evidence-based advocacy with different organisations, international organisations. And then that's how I sort of ended up at UNICEF with doing advocacy for the United Nations Girls Education Initiative, which then led me to sort of see a little bit more of the insides of the UN and how gender and sexual diversity was represented within the organisation or within UN agencies, and how that impacted how we talked about gender and sexual diversity, which then impacted our programs and responses, which were quite poor and still remain quite poor. We still talk, I still see publications coming out from the UN, even though we have organisations like Outright International that work directly with the UN. We have UN Equal, which is a body that's part of the UN that works around gender and sexual diversity and embedding that in the work that we do. However, I'll still see publications that are talking about men and boys, women and girls. Like even that language is just so frustrating to continually see come out of the UN, and you see it reflected in their responses. And because the UN primarily works through implementing partners in countries to respond to crisis or to do development, that's passed on. We're meant to be, the UN are meant to be the leaders in standard setting around human rights and inclusion, and yet they're not getting it right. Then our implementing partners or who we're working with in community is certainly not going to be likely to be adopting as well, or is going to adopt the language and the approach of the UN. So that's the long way around what I did. And of course, then my education, I studied criminology, Masters of Criminology whilst I was in Afghanistan, because I was working on healthcare. So working on nutrition access and coverage in Afghanistan. And I was traveling all around Afghanistan in hostile communities or communities experiencing conflict, active conflict. And I saw it as a way to further inform my understanding of terrorist organizations and how they operate, and international organized crime, which of course is there's an intersection there with the Taliban or there was at the time, let's say, in places like Helmand, where I was going to work and assess health centers for their nutrition services. So I saw that was such a big issue that affected our work around access, around how we would approach solutions, I guess, for community and whatnot. So I think yeah, that's how I ended up studying criminology. But it's been great, and it's been hugely useful in some of the other work that I've done that's outside of the specific work that I've been doing in LGBT communities, because obviously since I've worked in Somalia with law enforcement, you know, there are certain things that still can't be approached, obviously, in terms of gender and sexual diversity. But I guess working, it's helped me to edge a little bit more into the security space. It's a very slow moving space when we're just talking about the inclusion of women, full stop, or how we look at responding to gender-based violence as law enforcement, or within law enforcement and within military. So that's sort of been useful, I guess, as well. But it's often working in contexts where, I mean, in Somalia, it's just a do not touch LGBT, and obviously that's something that is not my mandate to work within, and also puts people at risk. But it's something that at least I can sort of use to talk a little bit more about, or think for myself about how I can talk a little bit more broadly, or try and introduce some more inclusive language when we are talking about gender and working specifically with women in law enforcement. So yeah, it's interesting. It's been an interesting non-linear path. Certainly not taken a direct path. I just have followed what is interesting, but the common thread is that just continuing to work with communities and vulnerable communities.
Yeah, it's really quite fascinating, and I'm really pleased that you shared that, because for anyone that's listening and thinking, well, I don't know how to make a difference, what can I be doing to make a difference, who may have that interest in some area and feel that perhaps they're not fulfilling their own personal potential to become somebody who wants to make a difference. Just hearing your story is enough to say, sometimes you just have to follow one thread, follow one thing that you're interested in, and be open to taking a chance, and see that the world is a big place and needs more active voices of people that are willing to go in and learn more, understand more, and be more open to hearing what's going on out there. And, you know, I do what I can in terms of keeping my knowledge base as open as possible, because I'm always into documentaries and trying to follow, you know, what is the rest of the world like in certain areas that are of interest to me. And I can honestly say there's never a day where I'm not, if not shocked, perhaps I'm not so prone to being shocked these days, but if I'm not shocked, I'm quite surprised and heartfelt, kind of heartbroken for people that are in communities where what we take for granted, particularly in a place like Australia that is pretty much open to change, and you know, even though sometimes we question that, but you know, from the global perspective, we're quite an advanced country with a lot of things that we do and have approved and have allowed to happen, which you know, in some countries you can't, as you say, you can't even go there, you don't even have that conversation, you don't touch the subject. And some of that is because of the threat of, you know, your own life could be at stake just daring to speak about it. So I think if anybody who is tuning into this, they're going to find it, there is a sense of purpose and opportunity for somebody who may be someone who may be working perhaps in the nursing field, or starting out in journalism, or somebody who doesn't know what they want to do, who may be a part of the gender and sexually diverse community. There are always ways that you can just take that one little step. And you say it wasn't a linear path, and it certainly wasn't. It was always fascinating to see that you're always in so many different countries, but I knew that what you were doing, I always felt that you had an enormous amount of courage to take on the challenges of being in countries where the political situation was often unstable. And, you know, even as you mentioned, sometimes it's the nutrition that's not available to people. Sometimes it's the government that's stopping people from having a voice. So I think what you've spoken about and the things that you've done, you know, it may only be early stages for the collective and what you're doing, but I know that your experience, you've got a wealth of knowledge in so many areas, even outside of the gender and sexually diverse aspect of things. you bring a lot to the table, and I certainly think it's quite remarkable what you do. I'm really interested. I'd sort of like to, because it's it can sometimes be perhaps a bit of a heavy topic what we're talking about, because there's certainly a lot at stake in some cases. I'd love to find out if you've got a story that is a real heartfelt success story, something really, really amazing that you know has come about because of any of the work that you've done. Is there a story you can share there?
Yeah, but just before I do that, I think, you mentioned, and I think often it's romanticized working in the humanitarian and development sector, expats coming into that. I have a lot of it's not like I'm going into these countries and I'm sort of at risk. Of course, I might experience a level of, if I'm with a same-sex partner in a country, there are certain precautions that I need to take, but there's a level of protection that I have as well, which is not afforded to the general population. So, it's not like I'm taking I don't see it as me taking a huge risk, let's say, and that's the advantage of having an outsider sort of come in and provide some support as well, because I have the protection because of the color of my skin and also because of my passport. To say a success story based on some of the things that we've done, I guess we successfully provided. I think the most recent thing is we met through sort of our networks working with sex worker advocates, a sex worker-led organisation called Lady Mermaids in Uganda, who are doing just fantastic work in a country where sex workers are criminalised, not recognised, where there is a large part of that population, or let's say a sizable part of that population are trans sex workers who are even more marginalised and at risk of gender-based violence and persecution. So if they are violated in the course of their work, there is no, the attitudes of police and and their access to justice is almost zero. I met with this organisation when I was in Uganda last year. They teamed up with a very well-known advocate called Keem, who is a trans sex worker advocate who's very well followed in Uganda. So they teamed up, so Lady Mermaids and Keem teamed up to provide some support to trans sex workers that were particularly impacted by the heavy restrictions that had come into place in Uganda as a result of COVID. We provided a large sum of money for the context, a larger sum of money to those groups to be able to deliver food packages to keep people going through the epidemic. And whilst that was happening, I think, our contribution here was financial. I think the thing that we sort of identified as Queer Here is that we don't want to get in the way of what's being done. And I think that comes from that idea, also comes from the disability sector. It's don't get in the way of people and their own decision making in their lives, So how can you support the good work that's being done and not inject your own, not try and push it for your own agenda? So for us, we supported the amazing work that they were doing. And then the external sort of, they also had some support by other sex worker organisations in Sweden, for example. And so we were able to just provide financial support for them to be able to sustain through the epidemic. And then as a result, one of the amazing things is that we see a lowering of HIV transmission rates. Of course, the other issue with COVID is access to antiretrovirals, etc. So they were also able to, whilst they were delivering that, the support, food packages, etc., they were connecting with the community and able to make sure that they were getting their access to medications, essential medications, and also testing, and creating, using that also as an opportunity to create a further bond with the community so that they would also be more likely to access their services post-COVID. So that was also, one of the wonderful things about that is it's not just about providing food, it's saying we're here for you. And these are the services that we offer as well, building that trust so that they can come back and access services freely and feel like they're a part of a community and have some protection and support there as well. So they also, Lady Mermaids is a fantastic organisation because they also provide psychosocial support. They'll have a lot of activist events, a lot of focus on self-care, which is like so important. Yes, some of that financial contribution goes towards that. And I think, as you were saying, how people can, you mentioned how can people help, and what impact can I have? Often it need just be informed financial support is a big thing. There are organisations already doing this amazing work that are with and for the community. So sometimes it's just a donation that is the biggest thing that you can do, the most impact that you can have. So being informed about, and that can happen in Australia. I mean, yes, we have, we have marriage equality now in Australia, and we have laws protecting gender and sexually diverse people. You go out into the rural areas and it doesn't, it doesn't equate in terms of acceptance, inclusion. Let's talk specifically about the Indigenous community and how they're already marginalised, right? This is a huge problem in Australia. And their access to health services already diminished, let alone let's talk about LGBT, rights and inclusion and self-expression and self-care when your basic rights aren't even being met in terms of access to healthcare, education and work. Yeah. So the thing that you can do, and you as in everyone can do, is to be informed about the issues that are happening locally near you and who's responding to those issues. Are they part of that community? And how can you support? Maybe it's volunteering, maybe it's providing financial support. So I think the way that you can best respond is to do that, and that's sort of a large part of our work now. That's why it's become a part of our work, because we do recognise that those people on the ground are best positioned to respond, and they are from that community, and it's our responsibility to sort of, or it is a responsibility, but it's also something that we can quite easily do to provide support, to just keep them doing that and help them to do it at scale.
Yeah. No, that makes an enormous amount of sense. So carrying on from our earlier comment where I was saying that, there might be someone who's listening to this going, I really want to be able to make a difference. I want to help. I want to be that person that goes and makes a difference. And as you're saying, quite literally, sometimes the easiest difference is be informed and, find a way to make a financial contribution to help those organisations and advocates and activists that are already doing the work. So, you wrap that up in a nutshell really well. It's always been really fascinating to learn that, the changes that we need to make sometimes are at the grassroots level, and they're at sometimes the most basic level. And, even as you mentioned, some of us take for granted the fact that we've got so many protections and so many policies and so many things that have happened, but even within our own country, we are failing some people appallingly, and we're not even recognising them for who they are culturally, let alone the diversity that may be taking place within that culture. So I know Australia's got a long way to go, but I look at it from a perspective also globally is, you're working in countries where the difficulties are beyond grassroots. These are just really, in essence, and I don't want to dumb this down, but what comes through in a lot of ways is just common human decency. We seem to just forget that sometimes we just need to respect that someone is different. And that's perfectly acceptable. But you're working in countries where that's not the case. And even though the person wants to express themselves and dares to risk it, and that's what is quite amazing to me, is that there are people that you associate with in terms of your support and your advocacy, they're putting their lives at risk just to express themselves for who they are. And, you know, I personally, I just can't wrap my head around that. I can't even imagine what that must be like, the fear that must be part of living your everyday, but the courage and the just being so bold and willing to step up and go, you know what, daring to live my life, I'm being an activist. That's almost the grassroots of it. And I just think, what's next for you in terms of where you are going? Obviously, Queer Here is still evolving and going and supporting in such a lot of ways. You're doing documentary work, so one of the things you mentioned is you love doing documentaries and doing stories. Is there any new project or anything on the horizon that you've got going?
Yeah, so right now we're working with a local organisation, Iskemie, who in Kenya. Sorry, I'm based in Kenya right now. So we've been talking to them for the past, the activist part of that organisation, and another organisation that's sort of related to that called Afro Idea, which is a feminist, started as a feminist blog, which gained huge popularity here several years ago, and then became or started to focus more on queer issues by nature of who was involved with that. And now it's branched out into providing, into Iskemie, one of the other organizations that are now working here in gender-based violence and also largely the queer community. So there's the intersection there. So we are providing some financial support to them to set up a safe house. So they have set up this safe house now here for victims of gender-based violence and their children. So that's one thing that we're working on, and then we'll be continuing to work on them with some more projects and solutions around gender-based violence specifically, and the queer community here in Kenya. So yeah, that's what's sort of next for us. We're also wrapping up some research and documentation that we gathered in Tunisia. So now we'll be producing some of that. Some of that's going to be poetry and an interview with some sort of prominent advocates there, activists there. So there'll be the next sort of big things. We're all sort of doing this on the sidelines of our main work or our income. So as we're approached, then we respond. So that's the other thing that I sort of wanted to mention. We're certainly not going into communities and saying X, Y, Z, this is what we think you need. We're usually approached by a community and then we go from there with them, unless we find otherwise that there may be a need for support that's come up through our networks, and then we can approach them and see, and validate and see if that's something or verify and see if that's something that they want support on. So yeah, and continuing that emergency funds. So if there are any LGBT activists out there, organisations that are looking for emergency fund to do a certain campaign, or they have a need for lawyers or whatever, COVID response, then that's something that we're keen to support on, aside from our sort of ongoing technical support that we provide and networking.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's
It's one thing I certainly want to make sure that before we wrap up, that we make sure that people have got ways to contact either yourself or whoever it is that you want them to contact at Queer Here for the support that you were talking about, and also any websites or any other links that you want people to have that will help them to connect in the right ways and provide any other community networking that is valuable to you. When you were talking, one of the things that came through really, really in my flash of imagination was I can just see what you're doing as being an amazing documentary on SBS. And for those who are listening outside of Australia, the SBS is a special broadcasting service. It's a very broad TV network here in Australia who are not afraid to step up and put some pretty in-your-face documentaries, and will cover a lot of subject matter and do so quite boldly. And I mean, I love watching SBS. I think it's one of the best networks on television, and really, really willing to step up and air a lot of subjects that just oftentimes it won't be talked about on any of the other networks for sure. But I see, Lexi, what you're doing, and it just, there's so much scope for you to create a documentary about this, and I think it would be a fascinating subject. And I mean fascinating not only just as a, you know, really interesting, but really insightful and valuable to not only Australians, but to the global community, to see a documentary that is literally broadcast on the television networks about this, to give people a more real insight into what you're doing. That said, though, one of the things I do know that is on your website, you've got some documented videos of some of the interviews and things that have taken place. So as a way of wrapping up, let's sort of put this in a bit of a nutshell, I suppose. What is it you do? Who do you do it for? And why do you do it? What's your summary there?
So what is it that I do? Supporting through Queer Here Collective, we support activists, academics and advocates all over the world working towards gender and sexual diversity at legislative and community behaviour change level. So we provide technical support, advocacy and visibility, supports documentation of stories to build a body of evidence about the human rights situation in regard to gender and sexually diverse people in various countries and contexts. And we also provide an emergency fund for activists that are experiencing, activists and communities that are experiencing difficulties around implementing their programs, or if there is a need for a lawyer, etc. Why do I do it? Because I'm a part of this community, because there was an identified need to raise the narrative with nuance around stories from the queer community and of the queer community, by the queer community, and that there is a need for that to be raised at an international level to influence UN agencies, decision makers, key donors that are working in communities in humanitarian response and development work, or working with governments that criminalise LGBT people. There is a need for them to change their language, their response, to integrate fully LGBT QIA issues, and for people from the community themselves to be at the forefront of that. So that's what and why I do it. And we have a website, of course, that just displays some of the stories. We've got podcasts on there, we've got videos on there, we've got interviews on there from people from all over the world, a lot from artists and creatives, from activists themselves, from a whole range, journalists, amazing journalists that have worked so tirelessly in countries where they're routinely imprisoned or shut down because of the work that they're doing around highlighting issues of LGBTQIA people. So that's all on the website. It's www.wearequeerhere.com. And if activists would like to contact us, or organisations would like to contact us to either join the collective or receive support in some way, or just get further information about the work that we're doing, they can contact us at contact@wearequeerhere.com.
Perfect.
So that's all on our website. All the details are on our website.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I was going to say just then, didn't want to interrupt you, but one of the things I wanted to say is that at the end of this video, one of the things that will be uploaded when this video is uploaded in the description area for both the YouTube channel and also for the podcast will be all the contact details. So for anyone who's watching who didn't catch all that information, or doesn't have a pen and paper, or whoever way you might want to record that information, you want to get in contact, it'll be all available at the bottom in the descriptions. So yeah, absolutely. So there'll be links available. There'll be ways that you'll be able to reach out and contact. Look, honestly, Lexi, it's been fantastic. It's been so great to be able to touch base with you again after all this time, but also it's been a really interesting conversation. I want to thank you for your time today. And if there's anything you want to wrap up with, is there anything else that you want to let people know before we go?
Thank you so much. No, this is amazing. I just want to say it's great that we have, that you're interested, that there are, that's my doorbell. So maybe start again.
Perfect timing.
No, I just want to say thank you. An amazing, It's been great that there are people like you interested in providing platforms to raise the profile of organisations, collectives, advocates that are working in and with vulnerable communities. For us, the LGBTQIA community and gender and sexually diverse people, it's really important that these sort of issues be continually raised and we continually hold space for our issues, because as you can see with the US election, things can just change. Just because we have our rights in legislation doesn't mean that they're embedded and that we can access them, and that they can be taken away at any time. And I think this is a time in which we can reflect that it is a continuous process. There's no end point here when we're talking about human rights. It's a continuous issue that we need to work on to access, maintain, and continue to protect. So thank you so much for this platform. I really appreciate it. And I just encourage people to get to our website and contact us if they want to be put in contact with other organisations that we work with anywhere in the world.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Lexi. It's been an absolute pleasure. Sounds like somebody's at the doorbell and would love to chat with you outside of being on the internet. Thank you so much, and it's been an absolute pleasure, and we will certainly make sure that all the details regards the website, etc., are loaded with this description. So without further ado, thank you so much, Lexi. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Terry. I appreciate it.